Imagine being born into a world where your destiny is sealed by your last name and your bloodline. In 16th century Europe, the mighty Habsburg dynasty ruled an empire where love and genetics took a back seat to power and purity. They believed that royal blood was too sacred to mix with commoners. Their solution? Marry cousins, or worse, nieces. The result was a family tree that twisted in on itself like a serpent devouring its own tail. This scene begins with the marriage of Philip I of Castile and Joanna of Castile, both grandchildren of the same monarchs. It was a union arranged more for maps than morals. As generation after generation followed suit, the family's genetic pool shrank dangerously. You see it most vividly in the portraits. Jaws that jutted unnaturally, chins that drooped like melted wax, and eyes that seemed perpetually distant. By the time their descendants inherited the throne, whispers had begun about strange behaviors, about children that didn't survive infancy, about queens with minds slowly unraveling in silk-draped halls. This was the foundation, the beginning of a bloodline that would lead to some of the most genetically ravaged women in royal history. And yet, these women were not just victims. They were princesses, empresses, queens, icons of elegance, crushed by the invisible weight of their chromosomes. Their lives weren't fairy tales. They were genetic tragedies written in gold ink and madness. Juana of Castile, history remembers her by one name, La Loca, the Mad. But Juana wasn't born insane. She was born into a lineage already trembling from within. Daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, Juana's royal pedigree was pure, pristine, and perilously inbred. Her Habsburg marriage to Philip the Handsome continued the family's tradition of cousin matching. Their union was politically powerful and genetically volatile. Juana's descent into madness wasn't sudden. It was a slow unraveling. After Philip's death, she refused to bury him. She traveled across Spain with his rotting coffin for years, sleeping beside it in candlelit monasteries, convinced he would wake. The court whispered. Her own children watched. Was it grief? Or was it the hereditary poison in her bloodline, winding through her brain like ivy through stone? Locked away for the rest of her life, Juana remained a queen in title, but a prisoner in reality. Her son, Charles V, would later continue the Habsburg cycle of inbreeding, and her legacy would become a blueprint of what happened when power eclipsed health. Juana's life was tragic, but it was also a warning that went ignored. She wasn't the first inbred royal woman to suffer, but she was one of the first whose suffering was etched into history with brutal clarity. She screamed in palace towers, clutched corpses in her arms, and died alone. Yet they still called her queen. Maria Anna of Spain was a woman born into a mirror. Her father was King Philip III of Spain. Her mother? Margaret of Austria, his own niece. That's right. Maria Anna's genetic inheritance wasn't just limited. It was practically recycled. Her family tree didn't branch. It looped. In 1631, she was shipped off to Vienna to marry her first cousin, Ferdinand III, the Holy Roman Emperor. The portraits of their wedding are magnificent. Velvet gowns, gold-threaded sashes, altars glowing with candles. But behind the grandeur lay a ticking biological time bomb. When Maria Anna bore children, the consequences of centuries of inbreeding exploded like a silent curse. Of her 6 children, only one survived to adulthood. Even that child, Leopold I, would go on to marry within the family, compounding the genetic damage. But Maria Anna wasn't just a passive vessel. She was politically savvy, fluent in 6 languages, and deeply involved in court diplomacy. Still, her body bore the burden of her lineage. Her pregnancies were fraught with complications. Her health deteriorated early, and her face, noble, pale, almost waxen, reflected the family deformities beginning to emerge. She died in her 40s, exhausted and frail. An empress in title, a ghost in function. Maria Anna's tragedy wasn't just in her early death. It was in her illusion of choice. She was born to serve dynastic survival. Her body was a battlefield between bloodlines and destiny. The cost: her health, her legacy, and her children's future. And in her palace chambers, no amount of gold could buy freedom from the face in a mirror. You've seen her before, even if you don't know her name. She stands in the center of Diego Velázquez's masterpiece Los Meninas, a child wrapped in lace and silence. That's Margaret Teresa of Spain, born in 1651, and her portrait tells more than just a story of court life. It's a silent record of centuries of inbreeding carved into the face of a child. Her father was King Philip IV of Spain. Her mother? Juana of Austria, his own niece. This made Margaret more inbred than the child of two full siblings. She had just one grandparent less than a normal person should. On paper, she was a miracle of dynastic politics. In her body, she was a catastrophe waiting to happen. She was betrothed at age 15 to her maternal uncle, Leopold I. Uncle. The union was celebrated with banquets, fanfare, and horror disguised as holiness. Margaret was small, sickly, and visibly frail. Her spine curved, her face drawn, and her body aged before its time. Her pregnancies were agony. She gave birth to 4 children. Only one survived. She was dead by 21. Even her surviving child would go on to marry within the family, repeating the cycle. Margaret was a girl turned sacrifice, a royal lamb dressed in brocade and pearls. Her every movement was shadowed by Velázquez's brush, but the truth of her pain was never painted. She was remembered as beautiful, but her beauty was a cage, and her legacy, a warning in silk and stillness. Maria I of Portugal was once called Maria the Pious. After all, she prayed constantly, to saints, to angels, to voices no one else could hear. Born in 1734, Maria was the daughter of King Joseph I of Portugal and Mariana Victoria of Spain, first cousins. When Maria married her uncle, Infante Pedro, it was seen as a divine union of Iberian bloodlines. But behind the divine facade, madness was brewing like storm clouds in the mind of a girl bred too tightly within royal walls. At first, Maria ruled with intelligence and grace. She was Portugal's first reigning queen, a woman with vision. But after years of compounded trauma, including the deaths of her husband, her eldest son, and her confessor, her mind collapsed. By her 50s, she was reduced to screaming fits and uncontrollable wailing that echoed through the corridors of the Ajuda Palace. Her doctors diagnosed her with religious melancholy. Today, we call it schizoaffective disorder, a condition likely exacerbated by generations of genetic entanglement. Her condition was so severe that foreign diplomats refused to be in the same room. Even her own son declared her unfit to rule and shipped her off to Brazil when Napoleon invaded. There, she lived out her last years like a phantom, disheveled, moaning, mumbling Latin psalms to walls that didn't answer. Maria I's story isn't just about madness. It's about how royalty confined in blood can become haunted from within. Her crown never truly fell, but her mind did. Charlotte of Belgium was born into opulence and into a trap of twisted bloodlines. Daughter of King Leopold I of Belgium and Princess Louise of Orleans, her ancestry was a royal labyrinth, entangled with repeated cousin marriages across France, Austria, and Portugal. The blood in her veins was as blue as they came, and as burdened. She married Archduke Maximilian of Austria, who was soon installed as Emperor of Mexico by Napoleon III. Charlotte became Empress Carlotta at just 24. It was a fairy tale painted in blood and ambition, with no happy ending. The Mexican throne was a poisoned chalice. Revolution flared, allies vanished, and Maximilian was captured and executed. Charlotte, across the ocean, broke. She wandered European courts in a fugue of fear, pleading with monarchs to save a husband already dead. She suffered violent paranoia, refused food, claimed her staff tried to poison her. Her mind shattered like porcelain under the weight of loss, trauma, and perhaps hereditary instability. Doctors diagnosed her with hysteria. She was barely 27. For the rest of her life, over 60 years, She lived in seclusion in Belgium, a royal ghost haunting palace gardens. She talked to trees, screamed at mirrors, and mourned a crown that was never truly hers. Visitors were forbidden. Mirrors were covered. She would never learn the full truth of her husband's death. Was it grief alone that drove her mad? Or did generations of tightly wound genetics snap under pressure? Charlotte was never meant to rule. She was meant to breed. But she bore no children, only tragedy. Elizabeth of Austria, known to the world as Sisi, was an empress of impossible beauty, untamed spirit, and deeply troubled blood. Born in 1837 to Duke Maximilian of Bavaria and Princess Ludovica, Sisi descended from a long line of Wittelsbachs, a dynasty so inbred, madness seemed a birthright. Her family had its own name for it, Dichonyx, the royal disease. At 15, Sisi was chosen to marry Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, her cousin. She was never meant to be empress. Her sister had been intended for the role, but Franz Joseph chose Sisi instead, mesmerized by her looks. Beauty became her prison. Her hair stretched to the floor. Her waist shrank to 19 inches. Her days were measured by hours of grooming, rigid diets, and obsessive exercise. Behind her dazzling facade, Elizabeth battled depression, eating disorders, and isolation. She detested court life. Her children were taken from her. Her influence was limited, and though she traveled constantly in search of peace, it never found her. Her family history haunted her. Relatives who descended into delusion, murdered spouses, or wasted away in lonely castles. Her son, Crown Prince Rudolph, would inherit not just the throne, but the dynasty's demons. In 1889, he killed himself in the infamous Mayerling incident, a scandal soaked in blood and despair. After that, Sisi dressed only in black. She refused portraits, avoided mirrors, and whispered to ghosts. In 1898, she was stabbed to death by an anarchist. She didn't scream. She reportedly whispered, "It's nothing." Perhaps she was right. Princess Victoria Melita had royal blood pouring in from every direction, and that was exactly the problem. She was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom and Tsar Alexander II of Russia. Her parents were first cousins. Her life was mapped out in advance. Marry her cousin, Prince Ernest of Hesse, keep the bloodline pure, and produce heirs with perfect pedigree. But the plan backfired. Their marriage was a disaster, haunted by coldness, rage, and hints of Ernest's secret sexuality. They had one daughter. Then they divorced. Scandal echoed through European courts like a thunderclap. Royals did not divorce. Royals suffered for tradition. Victoria Melita chose to rebel. She fell madly in love with another cousin, Grand Duke Kirill of Russia, a man she was expressly forbidden from marrying. She married him anyway. For that, she was banished from the Russian imperial family. Her name was removed from royal registers. Her inheritance frozen. But blood runs thicker than politics, and after the death of Tsar Alexander III, she was allowed back. It was a brief reprieve. The Russian Revolution swept through like fire, and Victoria Melita found herself once again fleeing the ghosts of her ancestry. Her cousin, Tsarina Alexandra, would be murdered. Her Romanov relatives shot in basements. Victoria escaped, her royal titles smoldering in the ruins of a collapsing empire. She died in France, far from the palaces of her youth, her body weakened by years of intermarried lineage, her spirit hardened by exile. Victoria Melita's life was one of passion, rebellion, and relentless repetition. Her family didn't just marry cousins. They recycled themselves until there was nothing left but ash. Zita of Bourbon-Parma was born into a family where bloodlines tangled like vines, 17 siblings, most of them from cousin marriages. The Bourbon-Parma dynasty was a cocktail of European royal DNA, French, Italian, Spanish, Austrian, folded over itself for centuries. By the time Zita was born in 1892, the genetic stitching was fraying. She married Archduke Karl of Austria, yet another distant cousin. When World War I exploded, Karl became Emperor of Austria-Hungary, making Zita empress at age 24. The crown was heavy. The empire was dying. Zita was brilliant, fluent in 5 languages, and deeply involved in politics. But intelligence couldn't stop inheritance. Her own siblings suffered from congenital deformities, neurological conditions, and premature deaths, evidence of bloodline collapse hidden behind palace doors. She and Karl had 8 children in 10 years. None were spared the genetic shadow. Some struggled with frailty, some with fertility, and all bore the quiet burden of inherited fragility. When the empire fell in 1918, Zita and her family were exiled. She wandered from country to country, Switzerland, Portugal, Belgium, living in hotels and borrowed houses. Her husband died young. Her eldest son, Otto, would fight his entire life to reclaim a throne that no longer existed. Zita wore widow's black for 67 years. She died in 1989 at age 96, an empress with no empire, a mother with a fractured legacy. She was buried in Vienna with full imperial honors. But the dynasty she married into? Gone. Zita was the end of a line, not the fall of a single woman, but the death rattle of centuries of royal incest, playing out in soft whispers and funeral bells. As we reach the end of this haunting journey through history's most inbred royal women, a chilling truth remains clear. The mirror they looked into was cracked, their reflections distorted by centuries of blood too tightly woven. Inbreeding was more than a genetic gamble. It was a social contract forged by power, tradition, and an obsession with purity. Each generation sacrificed health and sanity on the altar of dynastic survival, entrapping women like Juana la Loca, Margaret Teresa, and Elizabeth of Austria in invisible prisons made of their own DNA. These women bore not just crowns but curses, mental illness, deformities, shortened lives, and tragic destinies. Their beauty, intellect, and power were all shadowed by hereditary chains they could neither break nor escape. Yet, behind the tragic headlines and royal portraits, there were glimpses of humanity. Mothers mourning lost children, queens longing for freedom, and women screaming silently in gilded cages. The end of the Habsburgs and Bourbon Parmas was not just political collapse. It was the final chapter of a genetic tragedy writ large across Europe's thrones. Today, the dark legacy serves as a warning. When bloodlines fold inward, the cost is paid in flesh and soul. Looking into the royal mirror, we see the reflection of ambition and its price, a legacy both majestic and macabre, a story of women whose royal blood was both their gift and their doom. Their stories remain etched in history, haunting us with the question, how far will power go before it destroys those it was meant to protect?